The smell of burning paper filled my grandmother's old Victorian house in Salem, Oregon, as I watched my brother Marcus toss the last remnants of what looked like documents into the fireplace. It was a cold February morning in 2023, just 3 days after Grandma Rose's funeral, and we were supposed to be going through her belongings together, not destroying them. "Marcus, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as I stood in the doorway of her sitting room. He spun around, his face flushed with guilt and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Oh, hey, Sarah. I was just cleaning up some old papers. You know how Grandma kept everything." But I knew that wasn't true. In the 42 years I'd been alive, I'd never seen my grandmother throw away a single piece of paper that meant something to her. She kept birthday cards from when we were kids, recipe clippings from magazines, even grocery lists, because they reminded her of specific days. The woman who taught me that memories live in the smallest details wouldn't have had any trash worth burning. I walked closer to the fireplace, the wood floors creaking under my feet. The same floors where Grandma taught me to dance when I was 7, where she'd sit cross-legged with me doing puzzles on rainy afternoons. The embers were still glowing, and I could make out fragments of what looked like handwritten letters. My heart sank. "Those weren't trash, were they?" I said, kneeling down to get a better look at the remains. Marcus ran his hand through his dark hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. At 38, he still did it whenever he was caught in a lie. "Sarah, look, there were some things in Grandma's papers that didn't need to be preserved. Old grievances, family drama from decades ago. I was protecting everyone." "Protecting everyone from what, exactly?" He sat down heavily in Grandma's favorite armchair, the burgundy velvet one she'd inherited from her own mother. The late morning sunlight streaming through the lace curtains caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment, I could almost see her there, knitting and humming old show tunes. "There was a letter," Marcus said finally, "from Grandma to Mom, written years ago before Mom died. It said some things about Dad that could hurt his reputation now. My mother had passed away when I was 15, and my father had remarried 2 years later. He was now a respected city councilman in Portland, running for mayor in the upcoming election. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Oregon winter. "What kind of things?" "I don't want to get into it, Sarah. The point is, it's gone now. No one can be hurt by it." But as I stared at the ashes in the fireplace, I realized that someone had already been hurt by it. Me. Whatever that letter contained was part of my family's history, part of understanding my mother and grandmother's relationship, and Marcus had taken that away from me without even asking. "You had no right," I said, standing up and facing him. "Those weren't just your memories to destroy. I'm trying to protect our family. By erasing it?" The argument that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Marcus and I had always been close, despite the 4-year age difference. He'd been my protector in school, my confidant through my divorce 3 years earlier, my partner in caring for Grandma during her final months battling cancer. But as we stood in that room, surrounded by the lifetime of memories she'd carefully preserved, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The fight ended with Marcus storming out, promising to be back the next day to finish going through things properly. But I wasn't going to wait. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I went straight to Grandma's bedroom. Rose Martinez had been a teacher for 37 years before retiring, and she approached life with the same methodical organization she'd brought to her classroom. Everything had its place, and everything had its purpose. If there had been one important letter, there might be others. I started with her desk, a beautiful oak piece that had belonged to her father. The drawers were filled with the usual items: pens, paper clips, stamps, a magnifying glass. But in the bottom drawer, behind a stack of thank you cards from former students, I found something that made my hands shake. It was a small wooden box, carved with roses, that I'd never seen before. Inside were dozens of letters, all in my grandmother's careful handwriting, each one addressed to a different family member. They were dated over the course of several years, with the most recent one from just 2 months before she died. The letter on top was addressed to me. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I hope that means you found these letters before anyone else could take them away from you. I've watched your brother struggle with the truth about our family for years, and I'm afraid he might try to bury it along with me. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you deserve to know the truth about your mother's death, about your father's role in her final years, and about the choices I made that I'll regret until my dying day. "Your mother didn't die in an accident, sweetheart. She died by suicide." The letter fell from my hands as the words hit me like a physical blow. My mother, Elena, had died in a car crash when I was 15. At least, that's what I'd been told. The story was that she'd been driving home from her book club on a rainy night, lost control of the car on a curve, and hit a tree. Marcus had been away at college, and I'd been staying at a friend's house for a sleepover. I picked up the letter with trembling hands and continued reading. She'd been struggling with depression for months, made worse by your father's affair with Janet. Yes, the same Janet he married 2 years later. Your mother felt trapped, abandoned, and completely alone. I tried to get her to see a therapist, tried to convince her to leave your father, but she was convinced that divorcing him would destroy your and Marcus's lives. The night she died, she called me crying. She'd found evidence that your father was planning to leave her anyway, that he'd already been seeing lawyers about custody. She felt like she'd sacrificed everything for nothing. I should have gone to her immediately, but I was recovering from my own surgery and couldn't drive. I told her I'd come first thing in the morning. She drove to Riverside Park that night, the place where she and your father had their first date. She sat in the car for hours, writing letters to each of us. Then she drove to that curve on Highway 18, the one everyone said was so dangerous, and she let go of the wheel. Your father found her letters the next morning and destroyed them. He convinced the police that it was an accident, paid for a private autopsy that concluded the same thing, and swore me to secrecy. He said it would be better for you children to believe it was an accident than to live with the knowledge that your mother chose to leave you. I've carried this secret for 27 years, and it's been eating away at my soul. I should have fought harder for the truth. I should have fought harder for her. The letter went on to explain how my father had threatened to cut off my grandmother's access to Marcus and me if she ever told anyone the truth. How he'd used his growing political influence to make sure the official records stayed sealed. How my grandmother had spent decades watching him be praised as a devoted widower, while knowing the truth about what had driven my mother to despair. I sat on my grandmother's bed, surrounded by the quilts she'd made over the years, and cried harder than I had since she died. Not just for the grandmother I'd lost, but for the mother I'd never really known, and for the lies that had shaped my entire adult life. The other letters in the box were addressed to Marcus, to my father, to my stepmother Janet, and to several other family members. Each one contained pieces of the truth that had been hidden from us for so long. But as I read through them, I realized that Grandma had been strategic about what she'd revealed to whom. The letter to Marcus contained less damaging information about our father, focusing more on our mother's struggles with mental health. The letter to my father was a direct confrontation, demanding that he finally tell his children the truth. But it was the letter addressed to the district attorney's office that made my blood run cold. To whom it may concern, I am writing to provide evidence of a cover-up in the death of Elena Martinez, formerly Elena Rodriguez, on March 15, 1996. While the official cause of death was listed as accidental, I have reason to believe that evidence of suicide was deliberately suppressed by officials who were influenced by my son-in-law, Thomas Mitchell, who has since become a prominent local politician. I am enclosing copies of documents that were hidden from the initial investigation, including a letter my daughter wrote to me the day before her death, clearly expressing suicidal ideation, and records of payments made by Mr. Mitchell to various officials involved in the case. I understand that the statute of limitations may have passed for criminal charges, but I believe this information should be part of the public record, especially given Mr. Mitchell's current candidacy for mayor of Portland. This letter is to be delivered only in the event of my death, as I fear retribution against my family while I am alive to protect them. Sincerely, Rose Martinez. My hands were shaking as I realized what my grandmother had done. She'd built a case, documented everything, and prepared to reveal the truth after her death. And Marcus had almost succeeded in destroying it all. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading through every document in the box, making copies of everything, and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. By the time the sun was setting over the Cascade Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that my grandmother had always loved, I knew what I had to do. But first, I had to confront my father. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small apartment in downtown Salem, staring at the copies of my grandmother's letters spread across my kitchen table, trying to reconcile the man I'd called Dad for 42 years with the person described in these pages. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner, brewing the third pot since midnight, and the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the hardwood floors. At 6 a.m., I made the call. "Sarah, it's awfully early, sweetheart. Is everything okay?" My father's voice sounded groggy, probably because he'd been up late at campaign events. According to the local news, he was leading in the polls for the mayoral race. "I need to see you, Dad, today. It's about Grandma Rose." There was a pause. "Of course. Why don't you come by the house around 10? Janet's making her famous pancakes for Sunday breakfast." The house. That's how he always referred to the sprawling colonial in Portland's Pearl District that he'd bought with Janet 5 years after my mother died. I'd never been able to call it home, even though I'd technically lived there for my last 2 years of high school. It was beautiful, professionally decorated, and completely devoid of any trace of my mother or the life we'd had before. "Actually, I'd prefer to meet somewhere private, just the two of us." Another pause, longer this time. "Is there something wrong, Sarah?" "There's something we need to discuss about Mom." The silence stretched so long that I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the warm, paternal tone, replaced by something harder and more guarded. "I'll meet you at Pioneer Courthouse Square at noon, by the statue." Pioneer Courthouse Square was the heart of downtown Portland, always bustling with street performers, food carts, and tourists. It was also completely public, which I realized was probably intentional on his part. I spent the morning driving around the city, trying to work up the courage for what I was about to do. Portland in February was gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I passed by the hospital where I worked as a nurse, the coffee shop where I met my book club every month, the park where I walked my neighbor's dog when she was out of town. All the familiar pieces of my life that were about to change forever. At 11:45, I parked near the square and walked toward the statue where we'd agreed to meet. My father was already there, looking every inch the successful politician in his wool coat and polished shoes. At 65, Thomas Mitchell was still handsome in that distinguished way that served him well in public office. His hair had gone silver over the years, and he'd maintained the athletic build that had made him popular in high school. Looking at him, I could understand why my 18-year-old mother had fallen in love with him. "Sarah," he kissed my cheek, the same greeting he'd given me at every family gathering for years. "You look tired, sweetheart. Are you sleeping okay?" "Not really, no." We walked to a bench near the edge of the square, away from the crowd gathered around a street musician. The rain had stopped, but the air still held that damp chill that seeped into your bones. "So what's this about?" he asked, settling beside me with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. I pulled out a folder containing copies of some of the letters, not all of them, but enough to make my point. "I found these in Grandma's room yesterday, after Marcus burned the originals." My father's face went completely still as he recognized his own name on the envelope. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A group of tourists walked by, laughing and taking pictures, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was crumbling on this park bench. "Where did you find these?" His voice was quiet, controlled, hidden in her bedroom. "She left them for us to find after she died. All of us. There are letters for Marcus, for Janet, for me, and one for the district attorney's office." That got his attention. He turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before: fear. "Sarah, I need you to understand something about your grandmother. She was getting older, and sometimes older people, they remember things differently than they actually happened. They create stories that feel real to them, but aren't necessarily based in fact." "Are you saying she was lying?" "I'm saying she was confused. Your mother's death was a terrible accident. We all grieved. We all struggled to make sense of it. And sometimes when people can't accept that bad things just happen, they create explanations that feel more manageable." I opened the folder and pulled out one of the documents, a photocopy of a check made out to Wilson and Associates Private Investigation in the amount of $15,000, dated 3 days after my mother's death, and signed by Thomas Mitchell. "What was this for, Dad?" He stared at the check for a long moment, and I watched his political instincts kick in. The brief flash of panic was replaced by the smooth confidence that had won him elections for the past decade. "I hired a private investigator because I couldn't accept that your mother was gone. I needed to understand what happened that night, needed to make sure there wasn't anything I could have done differently. It was grief, Sarah. People do irrational things when they're grieving. And what did the investigator find? Nothing. Just confirmation that it was an accident like the police said." I pulled out another document, A bank statement showing a $10,000 withdrawal from my father's account the day before my mother's funeral, and a deposit of the same amount into an account belonging to Officer Raymond Chen, who had been the lead investigator on my mother's case. What about this? My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't know what that is. It's a bribe, Dad. You paid off the investigating officer to make sure Mom's death was ruled an accident. That's ridiculous. Raymond Chen was a family friend. If I gave him money, it was probably to help with his own family situation. His daughter was sick around that time, I think. But I could see the cracks in his composure now. The smooth politician was being replaced by someone desperate and cornered. I read her letter, Dad, the one Grandma wrote to me. She told me about Mom's depression, about your affair with Janet, about the phone call the night she died. She told me that Mom didn't crash accidentally. She let go of the wheel on purpose. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. A couple walked by with their toddler, the child's laughter a stark contrast to the heaviness of our conversation. My father was quiet for so long that I wondered if he was going to respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Your mother was sick, Sarah. She'd been struggling with depression for months, maybe years. I tried to get her help, but she refused to see a therapist. She said it would be admitting weakness. So you decided to have an affair instead? It wasn't like that. Janet and we were just friends at first. Your mother had become so distant, so angry all the time. She blamed me for everything that went wrong in her life. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. So you left her for someone else. I never left her. The words came out louder than he'd intended, and a few people looked in our direction. He lowered his voice again. I was trying to figure out how to help her, how to save our marriage, but she gave up before I could. She gave up because she found out you were planning to divorce her anyway. His face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I saw not the powerful politician, but the scared young man he must have been 27 years ago, faced with a situation he couldn't control. I was consulting with a lawyer about options, not because I wanted to leave her, but because I thought maybe if she saw that I was serious about getting help for her problems, she might agree to counseling. I was trying to save our family, not destroy it, by threatening to take away her children, by trying to get her committed to a psychiatric facility. She was having episodes, Sarah. Sometimes she wouldn't get out of bed for days. Other times, she'd rage about things that made no sense. I was terrified that she was going to hurt herself or hurt you kids. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. You were trying to have her committed? I was trying to save her life. He stood up abruptly, pacing in front of the bench. The lawyer said that if I could document her mental health issues, I could petition the court for an involuntary psychiatric hold. I thought if she got professional help, if she got on medication, we could fix everything. But she found out about the lawyer. She went through my desk while I was at work, found the retainer agreement, the notes about her behavior, the recommendations for psychiatric facilities. She called me at the office, screaming that I was trying to steal her children and lock her up like a crazy person. And that's when she called Grandma. He nodded, sinking back onto the bench. Your grandmother called me that night, begging me to come home and talk to your mother. But I was angry, Sarah. I was tired of being the villain in every conversation. I told your grandmother that maybe Elena needed to spend a night thinking about what she really wanted out of life. So you let her sit alone with that pain. I made the worst mistake of my life. His voice broke slightly. I thought she was manipulating me, using threats of self-harm to get her way. She'd done it before. Threatened to hurt herself if I didn't stop working late, if I didn't cancel plans with friends. I thought it was just another manipulation. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the city move around us. Portland's downtown was bustling with Sunday afternoon activity. Families heading to lunch, couples browsing the farmer's market, teenagers skateboarding past the food carts, all of them living their lives, unaware that mine was being reconstructed piece by piece. Why didn't you tell us the truth? I asked finally. Because I failed her, and I failed you kids. I thought if I could just make it go away, if I could create a story that didn't involve my failures as a husband and father, then maybe you could have normal lives. Maybe you could remember your mother without the shadow of mental illness and suicide hanging over everything. So you bribed officials to cover it up. He flinched. I paid people to be discreet. The coroner was going to rule it a suicide based on the evidence at the scene. The letters she'd written, the fact that there were no skid marks, the angle of impact. But I convinced him that ruling it an accident would be a kindness to her children. Officer Chen was sympathetic because he had kids of his own, and the private investigator was hired to make sure there weren't any other witnesses, any other evidence that could surface later. I needed to know that the story would hold. I felt sick, not just because of what my father had done, but because I was beginning to understand the impossible position he'd found himself in. A young man watching his wife spiral into depression, not knowing how to help her, making choices that seemed right at the time but had catastrophic consequences. What about Janet? I asked. When did your relationship with her become more than friendship? Not until after your mother died. I know how that sounds, but it's true. Janet was Elena's friend too. They'd known each other since college. After the funeral, she was one of the few people who didn't treat me like a pariah. She understood that I was grieving too, that I'd lost the woman I'd planned to spend my life with. But you married her pretty quickly, 2 years later, and only because you and Marcus needed stability. I wasn't ready to move on, but I thought having a mother figure in the house would be good for you kids. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo I'd taken of one of my grandmother's letters. This one is addressed to you, Dad. She was planning to send all of these to their intended recipients after she died, including the one to the district attorney's office. His face went pale as he read the first few lines. She was going to expose everything. She was going to tell the truth. Sarah, you have to understand. If this comes out now, it won't just destroy me. It'll destroy Janet. It'll destroy my campaign. It'll affect dozens of people who work for me. And for what? Your mother is still gone. The truth won't bring her back, but it might help me understand who she really was. She was your mother, and she loved you more than life itself. Isn't that enough? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd been carrying the weight of these secrets for nearly 3 decades. The silver hair, the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to curve inward slightly, as if he were protecting himself from invisible blows. This was the cost of living with lies. I don't know, Dad. I honestly don't know. What are you going to do with the letters? I haven't decided yet, but I think Marcus should know the truth. And I think I deserve to know everything, not just the version you thought would be easier for me to handle. He nodded slowly. If you're determined to do this, then I'd rather you heard it from me than from Rose's letters. There are things she didn't know, things I never told anyone. Like what? Like the fact that your mother was pregnant when she died. The world seemed to tilt sideways. What? She was about 6 weeks along. She'd just found out the week before. She thought it might save our marriage, give us something to focus on together. But when she found out about the lawyer, she became convinced that I'd try to use the pregnancy to have her committed more easily. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Another sibling, another family member who'd never had a chance to exist. The coroner found evidence of the pregnancy during the autopsy, but I asked him to keep it out of the official report. I didn't want you kids to know that she'd chosen to take another life along with her own. Oh God, I'm not telling you this to make you hate her, Sarah. I'm telling you because you said you wanted the whole truth. Your mother was in pain, emotional pain that was so intense she couldn't see any other way out. The pregnancy just made everything feel more impossible to her. I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to process what I'd just learned. The revelation about the pregnancy changed everything. It wasn't just about my mother's pain anymore. It was about a choice that had affected a life that never got to begin. I need time to think about all of this, I said. Sarah, please, before you do anything with those letters, remember that there are innocent people who will be hurt. Janet knew nothing about the cover-up. She genuinely believed your mother died in an accident. And what about my campaign staff? They've worked so hard for this election. What about Mom's family? Her sister in California, who still visits her grave every year on the anniversary? Her parents who died thinking their daughter was just unlucky? Don't they deserve to know the truth? They deserve to have peace. No, Dad. They deserve to have the truth, and then they can decide what to do with it. I started to walk away, but he called after me. Sarah, wait. There's something else you should know. I turned back, dreading what other revelation might be coming. Marcus knows. What? Marcus has known the truth about your mother's death for years, since he was 25. He came to me asking questions about inconsistencies he'd noticed in the official story. I told him everything, made him promise to keep it secret to protect you. The betrayal felt like a physical punch to the stomach. He's known for 13 years and never told me. He was trying to protect you, the same way I was. By lying to me? By sparing you the pain of knowing that your mother chose to leave you. I stared at him for a long moment, trying to process this final revelation. My brother, my closest confidant, the person I'd trusted with every other secret in my life, had been keeping the biggest secret of all. "That's why he burned the letters," I said. "He wasn't just protecting you from political embarrassment. He was protecting me from finding out that he'd been lying to me for over a decade." My father nodded. "He was trying to save everyone from reliving the pain. Well, he failed, because now I know everything, and I also know that the two most important men in my life have been treating me like a child who can't handle the truth." I walked away without looking back, leaving my father sitting alone on the bench in Pioneer Courthouse Square. But as I reached my car, I realized that the confrontation had raised more questions than it had answered. If Marcus had known the truth all along, why had he chosen this moment to destroy the evidence? What was he really trying to protect? And more importantly, what was I going to do with the knowledge that was burning like acid in my chest? I drove straight to Marcus's apartment in the Alberta Arts District, my mind racing with everything my father had told me. The revelation that my brother had known the truth about our mother's death for 13 years felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than anything my father had done. At least Dad had been trying to protect me from painful knowledge. Marcus had been sharing family dinners, holiday celebrations, and intimate conversations with me while keeping this massive secret. His apartment was in a converted warehouse that he'd bought and renovated himself. Marcus was a contractor who specialized in historic preservation, and his home was a showcase of his craftsmanship. Exposed brick walls, original hardwood floors, and custom-built furniture that had appeared in several local design magazines. Under normal circumstances, I loved visiting his place. Today, it felt like walking into enemy territory. I used my key to let myself in, a privilege he'd given me 3 years ago after my divorce when I was going through a particularly difficult time. "Marcus, we need to talk." He emerged from his workshop in the back, covered in sawdust and holding a piece of what looked like crown molding. When he saw my face, the wood slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. "You talked to Dad." I talked to Dad. I sat down heavily on his leather couch, the same one where we'd spent countless evenings watching movies and talking about everything except the one thing that mattered most. "How long were you planning to keep lying to me?" Marcus sat down in the chair across from me, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture. "Sarah, 13 years, Marcus. 13 years you've known that Mom killed herself, and you never said a word. I was trying to protect you. From what? From the truth about my own mother? From the guilt." His voice was quiet, and when he looked up at me, I saw tears in his eyes. "From the guilt that's been eating me alive for over a decade." "What guilt?" "I knew she was struggling, Sarah. The week before she died, she called me at college. She was crying, talking about how Dad didn't love her anymore, how she felt like she was losing everything. And I was 21 years old, and I was annoyed that she was calling me with her problems. I told her she was being dramatic, that married couples fight all the time, that she should stop trying to make me choose sides." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. I told her I had exams to study for and that I'd call her back later, but I never did. I was too busy with my own life, too selfish to realize that my mother was asking for help. "Marcus, when Dad called to tell me she'd died, the first thing I thought was that I could have prevented it. If I'd just listened to her, if I'd come home that weekend like she'd asked me to, if I'd taken her seriously, instead of dismissing her feelings as drama. You were a college student. You couldn't have known, but I did know." He stood up abruptly, pacing the length of his living room. "I knew she was depressed. I knew she and Dad were having problems. I knew she was struggling, and I chose to prioritize my own convenience over her pain. I watched my brother, this man who'd been my protector and role model my entire life, crumble under the weight of guilt he'd been carrying for decades. Is that why you became so involved in my life after my divorce? Why you insisted on helping me move, on checking on me every day, on making sure I was never alone when I was struggling?" He nodded. "I couldn't save Mom, but I could make sure I never failed you the same way." "And you thought the best way to do that was to lie to me about how she died?" "I thought the best way was to make sure you never felt like she did. Alone, abandoned, like nobody cared enough to really listen." He sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "When Dad told me the truth, it nearly destroyed me. Not just because of how she died, but because I realized I'd contributed to her decision. Dad said you figured it out on your own, that you came to him with questions. I started having nightmares about that last conversation with Mom. I kept replaying it in my head, remembering things she'd said that seemed like warning signs. So I did some research, looked into the accident report, talked to people who'd known her at the time. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that something didn't add up. What kind of things? Little things that wouldn't mean anything to most people, but that I knew were significant because I knew Mom. Like the fact that she'd cleaned the house from top to bottom the day before she died and organized all her important papers. Or that she'd called her sister in California and told her she loved her, which was unusual because they'd been fighting for months. Or that she'd written checks to pay all the bills 3 months in advance. She was getting her affairs in order. Exactly. And then there was the route she took that night. She told Dad she was going to her book club, but the book club met at Linda Patterson's house, which was in the opposite direction from where she crashed. She deliberately drove to that curve on Highway 18. The curve where she and Dad had their first date. You knew about that? Grandma told me in her letter. She said Mom wanted to end her life in a place that had once represented hope and love. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. When I confronted Dad with all the evidence I'd gathered, he broke down and told me everything. About the affair, about the legal consultation, about the cover-up, and he made me promise to never tell you. Why did you agree? Because by then, you were 28 years old and finally building a good life for yourself. You'd just gotten married, you were starting your nursing career, you seemed happy and stable. Dad convinced me that telling you the truth would only burden you with the same guilt that was destroying me. That wasn't your decision to make. I know that now, but at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. I thought I was protecting you from unnecessary pain. I looked around his apartment, noticing for the first time how many photos he had of our mother. They were everywhere, on the mantle, on his desk, tucked into the corners of mirrors. In every single one, she was smiling. Do you think she was really as happy as she looks in these pictures? I asked. I think she was happy when those pictures were taken. I think she had moments of joy, especially with us kids, but I also think she was struggling with something deeper that none of us understood at the time. Depression, anxiety, maybe other things. Mental health wasn't talked about the same way in the 90s. There wasn't as much awareness, as much support available. Dad said he was trying to get her committed to a psychiatric facility. Yeah, he told me about that too. It's one of the things that's haunted me the most. What if he'd succeeded? What if she'd gotten the help she needed? Or what if it had made things worse? What if being committed against her will had pushed her over the edge sooner? We sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts about what-ifs and might-have-beens. Finally, Marcus spoke again. Sarah, I need you to know that burning those letters wasn't just about protecting Dad's political career. It was about protecting you from the same guilt that's been destroying me for years. By keeping me ignorant, by keeping you innocent. You were 15 when she died, Sarah. You were a kid who needed to believe that her mother loved her enough to fight for her life. I didn't want you to spend your adult years wondering if there was something you could have done differently. But there wasn't anything I could have done. I was 15. Logic doesn't matter when it comes to guilt. I know intellectually that I couldn't have prevented her death, but emotionally, I've been carrying the weight of that last conversation for 27 years. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the street. It was getting dark outside, and the streetlights were starting to flicker on. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing and pushing each other playfully, and I wondered if any of them were carrying secrets that would reshape their understanding of their families. What do you think I should do with the letters, Marcus? I think you should burn them like I tried to do. Even the one addressed to the district attorney's office? He was quiet for a long moment, especially that one. Why? Because exposing the cover-up now won't change anything about Mom's death, but it will destroy a lot of innocent people. Dad's campaign staff, Janet, the families of the officials who were involved. Some of those people are probably dead by now. What about justice? What about accountability? What about mercy? He countered. What about recognizing that people sometimes make terrible decisions when they're grieving and desperate? I turned back to face him. I met with Dad today. He told me about the pregnancy. Marcus's face went white. He told you? You knew about that too? Not until years later. Dad mentioned it once when he was drunk on the anniversary of her death. He was talking about how he'd failed her, failed the baby, failed all of us. A baby that would have been our sibling. A baby that might have changed everything. Or might have made Mom feel even more trapped. We'll never know. Don't you think our mother's family deserves to know the truth? Her sister still sends flowers to her grave every year. Her parents died thinking their daughter was just unlucky. They died at peace, Sarah. Sometimes peace is more valuable than truth. I don't believe that. Then what do you believe? I sat back down, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I believe that living with lies is what destroyed our family in the first place. Mom felt like she couldn't tell anyone how much she was struggling. Dad felt like he couldn't admit that he didn't know how to help her. You felt like you couldn't share your guilt with me. And I've been living my entire adult life based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who my mother was. So, what are you going to do? I'm going to deliver the letters. Sarah, please, not all of them, and not immediately, but I'm going to deliver them to the people who deserve to know the truth. Starting with Mom's sister, Carmen. She has a right to know how her sister actually died. Marcus buried his face in his hands. This is going to destroy so many people, or it's going to free them from the burden of living with lies. And what about Dad's campaign? What about his reputation? I don't know yet. That's the one letter I'm not sure about. The one to the district attorney? Yeah, because you're right that it won't bring Mom back, and it will hurt a lot of innocent people. But I also think there's something fundamentally wrong with the idea that people in positions of power can cover up the truth just because it's convenient. So you're going to decide whether or not to destroy Dad's life? I'm going to decide whether or not to honor Grandma's wishes. She wanted the truth to come out after her death. She spent years documenting everything, making sure all the facts were preserved. Who am I to decide that her final wishes should be ignored? Marcus stood up and walked to his workshop, returning with a small wooden box similar to the one I'd found at Grandma's house. She left me letters too, he said quietly. Different ones. Letters she'd written to me over the years about my guilt, about forgiveness, about the importance of truth. You've had them this whole time? I found them in her dresser drawer when we were cleaning out her room last week, before you found the main collection. And you didn't think to mention them? I was hoping I could destroy all of it and spare everyone the pain. But after our fight yesterday, I realized that wasn't my decision to make. He handed me the box. These are yours now. All of it. The decision about what to do with the letters should be yours, not mine. I opened the box to find a dozen more letters, all addressed to Marcus in my grandmother's careful handwriting. The dates ranged from just after my mother's death to as recently as last Christmas. Have you read them? Some. Enough to know that Grandma understood my guilt better than I thought she did. Enough to know that she forgave me for things I didn't think anyone could forgive. What kinds of things? Read them yourself. But Sarah, there's one more thing you need to know before you make your decision. What? Grandma was planning to tell you the truth herself. She'd been working up the courage for months before she got sick. The letters were her backup plan, in case she died before she could have the conversation. She was going to tell me? She felt like she'd failed you by keeping the secret for so long. She said in one of her letters to me that watching you struggle through your divorce, seeing how much you blamed yourself for not being able to save your marriage, reminded her too much of your mother's pain. She didn't want you to carry that kind of guilt without understanding where it came from. My divorce reminded her of Mom? The way you internalized the failure, the way you convinced yourself that if you'd just been a better wife, a more supportive partner, you could have prevented it. She saw the same patterns in you that she'd seen in Mom. The observation hit me like a revelation. My ex-husband had cheated on me with a coworker, and despite all the evidence that he was the one who'd destroyed our marriage, I'd spent years wondering what I could have done differently. What if I'd been more attentive? What if I'd been more supportive of his career? What if I'd tried harder to make him happy? She thought I was repeating Mom's patterns. She thought you were both women who took responsibility for other people's choices, who blamed yourselves when the people you loved made decisions that hurt you. Is that why she wanted me to know the truth? So I'd understand that Mom's death wasn't about anything I did or didn't do? Partly. But also because she believed that you deserved to know who your mother really was. Not just the perfect memory that Dad had constructed, but the real woman who struggled with depression and fear and overwhelming love for her children. I held the 2 boxes of letters in my lap, feeling the weight of all the secrets they contained. 27 years of hidden truths, buried guilt, and carefully constructed lies. All of it was mine to decide what to do with. Marcus, if I deliver these letters, if I tell the truth about what happened, are you going to be okay? I don't know, but I think I'm ready to find out. I'm tired of carrying this guilt alone. And if I decide not to deliver them, if I choose to protect Dad's career and everyone else's peace of mind, then I think we'll both spend the rest of our lives wondering if we made the right choice. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw not just the guilt he'd been carrying, but the relief that was starting to replace it. For the first time in our conversation, he seemed lighter somehow. "There's something else I need to tell you," I said. "Something I realized while I was talking to Dad." "What?" "I'm not angry that Mom chose to end her life. I'm sad about it, and I wish she'd found another way to deal with her pain. But I'm not angry at her for making that choice." "Really?" "Really. But I am angry that I've spent 27 years not knowing who she really was. I'm angry that every time I've struggled with depression or anxiety, I've had to figure it out on my own instead of understanding that I might have inherited those struggles from her. I'm angry that when my marriage was falling apart, I didn't have the context to understand that I was repeating patterns that had been in our family for generations. So you're going to deliver the letters." "I'm going to deliver some of them, starting with the one to Aunt Carmen and the one that Grandma wrote to me about Mom's real struggle with mental health. I want to understand my mother as a whole person, not just as the tragedy that defined our family." "And the one to the district attorney?" "I'm going to sit with that one for a while, maybe talk to a lawyer about what the implications would be. But I'm not going to make that decision today." "Fair enough." I stood up to leave, carrying both boxes of letters. At the door, I turned back to Marcus. "I forgive you for keeping the secret," I said. "I understand why you did it, even if I don't agree with your choice. And I'll support whatever you decide to do with the letters," he replied. "Even if it means our family is never the same. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe our family needs to be different than it's been." As I drove home through the dark Portland streets, I thought about the conversation I was going to have with my Aunt Carmen in California, about the letters I was going to read from my grandmother to my brother, about the decision I was going to have to make about my father's political career and the officials who had helped him cover up the truth. But mostly, I thought about my mother, not the perfect victim of a tragic accident that I'd mourned for 27 years, but the real woman who had struggled with depression, who had felt trapped and alone, who had made an impossible choice in a moment of overwhelming pain. For the first time since her death, I felt like I was finally going to get to know her. 3 weeks later, I stood in the hallway outside Courtroom 4A in the Multnomah County Courthouse, holding a folder that contained copies of every letter my grandmother had written. The past 21 days had been a whirlwind of difficult conversations, legal consultations, and sleepless nights, but I'd finally made my decision about what to do with the truth. The first letter I'd delivered was to my Aunt Carmen in San Diego. I'd driven down to California the weekend after my conversation with Marcus, carrying with me not just my grandmother's letter, but also my own handwritten account of everything I'd learned. Carmen was 59 years old, a retired teacher who lived alone with 3 cats and a garden that would have made my grandmother proud. When I told her the truth about her sister's death, she didn't seem surprised. "I always wondered," she said as we sat in her sunroom, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the sound of fountain water. "Elena called me the night she died, you know. She was crying, talking about how she felt like she'd failed everyone she loved. I told her she was being dramatic, that things would look better in the morning. You couldn't have known what she was planning, but I should have. She was my little sister. I knew her better than anyone, and I knew she was in pain. But I was dealing with my own problems at the time. My divorce, my kids acting out, and I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to really listen to her." Carmen's reaction taught me something important about guilt and forgiveness. She'd been carrying her own version of the secret for 27 years, wondering if that last phone call had been her sister's way of asking for help. Learning the full truth about Elena's mental health struggles and the circumstances that led to her death didn't erase Carmen's regret, but it did give her a context for understanding her sister's pain. "She wasn't just being dramatic," Carmen said after reading all of my grandmother's letters. "She was drowning, and none of us knew how to throw her a lifeline." The second letter I delivered was to Janet, my stepmother. That conversation was held in her pristine kitchen in the Pearl District house over coffee and homemade scones that neither of us had much appetite for. Janet was 56 years old, a former elementary school principal who had retired early to support my father's political career. She was kind, organized, and completely unprepared for the revelation that her husband had lied to her about the circumstances of his first wife's death. "I knew Elena was struggling with depression," she said, after I'd explained everything. "She'd confided in me about it during our book club meetings, but Thomas always said she'd been getting better, that she'd been talking about going back to school, making plans for the future. He wasn't lying about that part. According to Grandma's letters, Mom was trying to fight through her depression. But finding out about the legal consultation, about the possibility of being committed against her will, pushed her into a crisis. And Thomas covered it up to protect you children, and to protect himself from having to explain his role in what happened. Janet was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the garden she'd spent years cultivating. I fell in love with a man who I thought was a devoted widower, someone who had loved his wife so much that he could barely talk about losing her. He did love her. In his own way, he did love her, but he also betrayed her, and then he lied to me about it for 20 years. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. I need time to process all of this. The hardest letter to deliver was the one to Marcus. Not because our conversation was difficult, but because reading my grandmother's words about forgiveness and healing forced both of us to confront the guilt we'd been carrying for decades. My dear Marcus, one of the letters began, I know you blame yourself for your mother's death, but I need you to understand something that took me years to learn. Your mother's pain was bigger than any single conversation, any single moment of support or lack thereof. She was fighting a battle inside her own mind, and that battle was not something you could have won for her. The night she called you at college, she was looking for a reason to keep fighting, not because she expected you to save her, but because she needed to know that her children were building good lives for themselves. When you told her about your exams, about your busy schedule, about your normal college problems, you gave her exactly what she needed, evidence that you were thriving despite her struggles. She didn't die because you failed to save her. She died because the pain became too overwhelming to bear. And the guilt you've been carrying all these years is not honoring her memory. It's allowing her pain to claim another victim. Reading those words, watching Marcus cry as he finally began to forgive himself, was one of the most difficult and beautiful moments of my life. My grandmother had known exactly what each of us needed to hear, and she'd spent her final years crafting messages that would help us heal. But it was the letter addressed to the district attorney's office that posed the biggest challenge. After consulting with 3 different lawyers, I learned that while the statute of limitations had passed for criminal charges, the information contained in my grandmother's documentation could still have serious consequences for my father's political career and for the families of the officials who had been involved in the cover-up. The decision about whether to deliver that letter was ultimately made for me by my father himself. On a Tuesday morning in early March, the Oregonian published a front-page story about my father's campaign finances. An investigative reporter had discovered a series of questionable payments made over the years to various officials and private investigators, including the same Officer Raymond Chen and private investigator mentioned in my grandmother's letters. The reporter didn't know about my mother's death. The payments were being investigated as possible corruption related to my father's business dealings as a city councilman. But I knew that if journalists were already digging into his financial records, it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. That evening, my father called me. Sarah, I need to withdraw from the mayoral race. Because of the newspaper story? Because Janet left me. Because I can't continue living with these lies. Because I'm tired of being the kind of man who covers up the truth to protect his own interests. What are you going to do? I'm going to hold a press conference tomorrow morning. I'm going to tell the truth about your mother's death, about the cover-up, about all of it. Dad, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Your grandmother was right. The truth deserves to come out, even if it destroys me. What about your campaign staff? Your supporters? They deserve to know who they've been working for, and they deserve better than to find out from a newspaper investigation. The press conference was held the next morning in the same Pioneer Courthouse Square where my father and I had our difficult conversation weeks earlier. I stood in the crowd, listening as he told the assembled reporters about my mother's struggle with depression, about his affair with Janet, about the circumstances that led to Elena's suicide, and about his decision to cover up the truth. I convinced myself that I was protecting my children, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. But I was really protecting myself from having to face the consequences of my failures as a husband and father. Elena Martinez deserved better from me when she was alive, and she deserved better from me after her death. The story dominated the local news for weeks. My father was forced to resign from the city council and face a federal investigation into the corruption charges. Officer Chen, who was now retired, was questioned, but not charged, due to the statute of limitations. The private investigator had died years earlier. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of my father's confession. Letters began arriving at the newspaper from other families who had lost loved ones to suicide, thanking him for his honesty and for helping to destigmatize mental health struggles. Mental health advocates praised his admission as an important step in changing the conversation about depression and suicide prevention. And I began to understand something that my grandmother had known all along. Sometimes the truth is more powerful than the lies we tell to protect ourselves from it. 6 months later, I stood in my grandmother's garden behind the house in Salem, planting the roses she'd requested in her final letter to me. Marcus was there, along with Carmen, who had driven up from California, and even Janet, who had begun speaking to me again after she'd had time to process everything. My father wasn't there. He was serving a 2-year sentence for obstruction of justice, but he'd been writing to me regularly from prison. Honest letters about his regrets, his hopes for making amends, and his gratitude that the truth had finally come out. "Do you think she would have wanted this?" Marcus asked as we worked in the garden together. "All the publicity, all the pain it caused? I think she would have wanted us to know the truth about her," I said. "And I think she would have wanted other families to learn from her story." The final letter my grandmother had written was addressed to my Elena's children, and it contained the most important message of all. Your mother's life was not defined by how it ended. She was a woman who loved deeply, who fought hard against her own demons, and who made an impossible choice in a moment of overwhelming pain. She was not a victim of circumstance. She was a human being struggling with an illness that she didn't fully understand, and that the people around her didn't know how to treat. Don't let her death be the only thing you remember about her life. Remember her laughter, her terrible singing voice, her obsession with organizing closets, her ability to make everyone feel welcome in her home. Remember that she taught you to be kind, to be curious, to stand up for people who need help. And remember that mental illness is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's a medical condition that deserves treatment, understanding, and compassion. If sharing your mother's story helps even one person seek help before it's too late, then her death will have served a purpose she never could have imagined. As I planted the last rose bush, I thought about the conversation I'd had with a woman named Lisa the week before. She'd read about my family's story in the newspaper and called to tell me that it had inspired her to seek help for her own depression. She was now in therapy, on medication, and building a support system that would help her through her darkest moments. "Your mother's story saved my life," she'd said. "It made me realize that asking for help isn't giving up. It's fighting back." That evening, as the sun set over the Cascade Mountains, I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, reading through all of her letters one final time. In the margins of several pages, she'd written notes that I hadn't noticed before, observations about healing, about forgiveness, about the courage it takes to live with truth instead of comfortable lies. One note, written in pencil on the back of the letter addressed to me, caught my attention. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for the people we've lost is to make sure their stories are told honestly, not to make them saints or villains, but to honor them as the complex, flawed, beautiful human beings they actually were." I folded the letters carefully and put them back in their wooden box. Tomorrow, I would donate them to the local mental health advocacy organization, along with my grandmother's house, which would be converted into a support center for families dealing with suicide loss. But tonight, I would sit in this kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and old books, and I would remember my mother not as the tragic figure who had haunted my family for 27 years, but as the woman who had taught me that love sometimes means letting go, that courage sometimes looks like asking for help, and that the truth, even when it's painful, is always worth telling. The last thing I did before leaving the house was write a letter of my own. Not to anyone in particular, but to all the families who might find themselves in similar situations, who might be tempted to bury painful truths rather than face them. The truth doesn't always set you free immediately. Sometimes it makes things harder before it makes them better. But living with lies is like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. Eventually, everything falls down. Your loved ones deserve to be remembered for who they really were, not for the perfect versions you create to protect yourselves from pain. And you deserve to understand your own story, even if that story is more complicated than you wished it would be. My mother died by suicide 27 years ago, and it took me until today to finally know her. Don't let that happen to your family. Tell the truth, seek help when you need it, and remember that healing is possible even when the wounds seem too deep to ever close. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is refuse to let our pain define us and refuse to let our loved ones' pain be their only legacy. As I drove away from my grandmother's house for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding difficult truths, but the kind that comes from finally understanding that love and pain can coexist, that families can heal from even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that are hardest to tell. My brother Marcus had been right about one thing. Our family would never be the same after the truth came out, but he'd been wrong about something else. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. We were different now, but we were also more honest, more compassionate, and more committed to supporting each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. And somewhere, I hoped, my mother and grandmother were finally at peace, knowing that their stories had been told with love, with honesty, and with the kind of courage they'd always hoped we'd find.